I'm very happy to open this conference, international conference, that will take place for the coming days. And my name is Doron Mendels, and although I am an ancient historian, I am still the chairman of the academic committee of the center, working together with my dear friend Robert. And it's true that in antiquity you cannot really speak of antisemitism in the modern sense of the word, but I think we can speak about multiculturalism in a way, and in particular on ethnic identity in antiquity. And ethnic identity is quite connected to the problem of how people see others. And here we have many, it's all relative, many texts of pagans that refer to Jews. And this in itself is very interesting, and many people thought it is kind of the beginning of anti-Semitism. I'm not sure that it is, but unfortunately I was not invited to give a talk in this conference about the beginnings, so I will just tell you something about the center. The Vidal Sassoon International Center, as some of you I'm sure know, for the study of anti-Semitism, is an interdisciplinary research center that was founded in '82. The center is dedicated to independent, critical approach of various aspects of anti-Semitism and the reaction towards anti-Semitism. The center supports research on anti-Semitism throughout the ages, and it's true that this year we gave a stipend to a guy who deals with antiquity, actually, and I think it's the first time that we gave a stipend to someone who deals with modern research on antiquity referring to anti-Semitism. The center holds a large number of academic events, such as lectures, symposia, and international conferences, quite a bit, and produces many academic publications. The center also nurtures relationships with researchers, universities, public organizations in Israel and abroad, and has become quite a famous center for the study of anti-Semitism all over the world. The Felix Posen annotated bibliography on anti-Semitism is one of the center's major ongoing projects and is an essential guide for scholars and students. The Best Bibliography Award was given to Susan Cohen, the editor of the bibliography, in 1995 by the Research and Special Libraries Division of the Association of Jewish Libraries in the United States. Since October 2002, when my friend Professor Robert Wistrich was nominated head of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Antisemitism, the center's academic and public activity has greatly expanded, and not only within the university itself, and not only within the universities of Israel, but also internationally. And I think a very important facet has been kind of added to this center, that it became very much associated, connected to outside groups, organizations, and even the government.
I want to take this opportunity to say a word of thanks to Robert Wistrich, because in the period that Robert has been the head of the Vidal Sassoon Center for the Study of Antisemitism, and I'm very pleased that he has agreed to continue to do another term and has even adjusted his sabbatical schedule so this will be possible. He has really transformed this center into one of the most vibrant centers in certainly in the Faculty of Humanities, but I would say in the entire university. He has expanded the scope, the range, and the historical outlook of the center. He has moved it from the traditional subjects that it dealt with so well, but also for so long. And this conference is a testimony to the vision that Robert has brought to these activities. On the one hand, I wish that all the directors of centers were as active as Robert. It might mean that I would spend all of my time as dean giving greetings at different conferences and events. But that would be something that I would be willing to accept. I want to again, as Doron said, apologize that I'm going to have to immediately leave, but we're in our Board of Governors week, and you all can imagine what that means in terms of the schedule. Some of the people in the audience were here already this morning when I did my first morning greetings for Cardinal Martini, who was given an honorary doctorate for his work in interfaith activities and gave a lecture today at the university. And the day is still long and the governors are still awake, so there is still more to do. Again, welcome to everybody. It looks like a wonderful conference, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Steve. We will really miss you as dean. We can now proceed, and we will to our main event of this evening. And this is Robert's lecture. I wish just to actually add just one sentence on what Steve has said about Robert, that I'm very much impressed. I was always impressed in the last 3 years to work with Robert, who has really not only a vision, but I think he is a fantastic administrator. And in a moment you will see what an academic he is, but you all know that. But I think he is a fantastic administrator, academic administrator, and in many years in the university, I haven't seen someone who really has this kind of this approach to things, even daily matters. And I really hope that you will do the same in the next 3 or 4 years. Now, Robert, as you might know, holds the Neuberger Chair for Modern European and Jewish History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Since 2002, he has been the director of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Antisemitism and the initiator and organizer of international conferences. And I must say, even during the kind of very difficult times here, he really managed to organize conferences and international conferences. Professor Wistrich is an internationally recognized authority on the subject of antisemitism, a topic examined in a number of his many books, some of which obtain important international prizes. They include The Jews of Vienna in the Age of Franz Josef in Oxford, 1989, which won the Austrian State Prize for History. I didn't know that, Robert. And Antisemitism, The Longest Hatred in 1992, which received the H. Wingate Prize for Nonfiction in the United Kingdom. One of his recent books, Hitler, Europe and the Holocaust, in Random House 2001, has already been translated into 25 languages, including Japanese and Chinese, almost like the Bible. Professor Wistrich's latest book in Hebrew has just appeared with the Carmel Press in Jerusalem, and it's called Ma'abadat Heres? Ma'abadat Heres. Ma'abada Leheres. I haven't seen it yet. Ma'abada Leheres. העולם, גרמנים ויהודים במרכז אירופה. A longer version will appear later this year, published by the University of Nebraska Press and the Center, and its title will be Laboratory for World Destruction, Germans and Jews in Central Europe. Robert has been very active in the struggle against anti-Semitism in recent years, advising the United States Department, the British Parliament, high French officials, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as the Israeli government and major international Jewish organizations. We really needed it. During the past 15 years, he has also scripted, edited, co-produced, and acted as historical advisor for a number of major documentary films directly related to anti-Semitism. I'm sure you have seen at least one or two of them, and they include The Longest Hatred, PBS 91, a much acclaimed film on the history of anti-Semitism, Blaming the Jews, BBC Channel 4, and he also served as a scientific advisor for Obsession, the 77-minute documentary, whose premiere screening will take place during this conference on Wednesday at 7. You all should note that down, at the Truman Institute building on the campus of the Hebrew University. And now I will call Robert to give the first address in this conference on anti-Semitism and multiculturalism, the uneasy connection. Robert, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, welcome. Bienvenue. Willkommen. Bruchim habayim. I could go on. This is a multiculturalist conference. It's also a polyglot conference. And I think that in the course of the coming days, many of the points that I can only very briefly sketch here tonight will be amplified, clarified, and I hope will lead to new understandings of the problem that we'll be dealing with. First of all, I'd like to thank Doron for his warm words. You know, from my experience of working together with Doron Mendels, I can say the first rule in choosing an academic chairman is that you choose somebody who is not only a true colleague, but also a friend and somebody who empathizes with and understands what you're trying to do. I've also been very fortunate that all the people I work with, the wonderful people who constitute this team that very deservedly won the award of the Hebrew University, can be relied upon in every way in matters of organization and in attention to detail, without which none of all this would happen. Let me briefly say I was reluctant, believe it or not, to give this keynote address. First of all, I'm very well aware of the limits of any keynote address. One is always liable to say either too much or too little. And I have a problem with this kind of a presentation because one can't possibly anticipate the rich, variety of presentations that are going to be made in the course of the coming days. Therefore, do not expect to hear some kind of grand synthesis tonight, not even a roadmap, which is not to be recommended in this part of the world. Perhaps a sketch, a vision of some of the problems which I think now more than ever are timely, need to be addressed in the way that this conference will try to do them. There is a large literature on multiculturalism. There's a vast literature on anti-Semitism. There's a significant body, corpus of writings on ethnic identity. What I think it is fair to say has been lacking is an attempt to try and put these constituents together and to see how they interconnect. To that extent, I believe that we are entering uncharted waters, and perhaps this conference will succeed in throwing a bridge across those waters and lead us, like the Israelites of old, to dry land. Now to my theme. Let me begin with a quote from an interview in 1991 by Sir Isaiah Berlin on the ingathering storm of nationalism. His remarks were made at a truly historic moment, as the USSR definitively unraveled, rent asunder by resurgent nationalist republics, as ethnic warfare began raging in Yugoslavia, which led to the demise of that multinational state within a decade. Sir Isaiah, despite his awareness of the bitter nationalist conflicts that inevitably arose, naturally rejoiced at the crumbling of the Berlin Wall and watching the Soviet Tower of Babel collapse in ruins. And in the course of this interview, he referred to that metaphor, the Tower of Babel. He recalled that it was meant to be unitary in character, I quote, "a single great building reaching to the skies with one language for everybody. The Lord," he said, "didn't like it." And he added, with a touch of Oxfordian irony, that he'd been told there was an excellent Hebrew prayer to be uttered when seeing a monster. "Blessed be the Lord our God, who introduced variety among his creatures." And perhaps we might add, and what if multiculturalism is producing a monster? And irony aside, let us consider the question of unity and variety, of uniformity and difference, as it is reflected in the biblical story. Remember, it begins with these lines: "And the earth was of one language and of one speech. Vayehi kol haaretz safa achat b'dvarim achadim." And we are told in Genesis that the children of men decide to build a city with its tower to heaven, to make themselves a name so they may become one people, Am Echad, with one language, Safa Echad lekulan. If we try to put this in contemporary terms, before the Tower of Babel is brought down by a divine hand, the world was living in a monoculture. The builders of the tower, so it would appear, in a supreme act of hubris and self-exaltation, seek to create a monolithic state or empire which will replicate the structure of the cosmos. Proud of their technological prowess, they will storm the heavens, imposing an artificial unity on mankind. You might call it the ultimate global project, or perhaps the first totalitarian act. And the Lord comes down to see the city and the tower. And what does he say? And this is what they begin to do. And now nothing will be withholden from them, which they purpose to do. One language and one speech, instruments of order and conformity. So therefore, the Lord decides to confound this totalitarian vision so that the children of men will be scattered upon the face of the earth, and they will no longer understand one another's speech. In other words, after Babel, mankind is divided into a multiplicity of cultures, languages, peoples, and civilizations. There is no universal language. There is no one truth about the human condition, which is valid for all times and places. There's no single faith that can be imposed, that should be imposed, according to the Judaic or the Hebraic understanding on all humanity. And here's an important difference, surely, with Christianity and Islam. What we have here in the story of Babel is a powerful parable against empire builders, imperialists, totalitarian rulers, Promethean ideologues, and fundamentalists who would impose a single regime upon a plural world, who worship homogeneity, sameness, and uniformity. Post-Babel, we might say, pursuing this metaphor a little further, that the fact of difference defines the human condition. Of course, I'm not saying that the creator of the universe is a multiculturalist. I'm not suggesting that the God of Israel is an advocate of ethnic diversity. Nor do I mean that contemporary Jews should automatically favor cultural and or political pluralism. But it seems to me that within the Jewish tradition, as part of a perennial tension between the particular and the universal, there is a special sensitivity to questions of identity, questions involving the dignity of human beings, the need for freedom from coercion, respect for difference, and for the rights of the stranger. Le'ehov et hager, to love the stranger. This injunction appears 36 times in the Hebrew Bible. Surely this is a core message of the Judaic tradition, irrespective of how it has been practiced or realized in the past and today. We could also make the case that the Jews were the first global people, the first to grapple with the reality of worldwide dispersion, while maintaining their unity and identity as a nation. Not only that, but in the diaspora, force majeure, they became a multilingual and multicultural people. able to adapt despite the odds, despite the lack of a territorial homeland, a state, a political center for nearly 2,000 years. An extraordinary anomaly in the annals of history. And I would suggest one of the deeper causes of anti-Semitism. Jews have a multiple identity. Just think of the difficulty to this day in defining what the Jews are. A religion, an ethnic group, a global diasporic nation, a cultural community, or now a sovereign state. And one of the implicit questions, perhaps underlying this conference, I don't know whether it will be addressed or not, is what happens to these unique characteristics in an age of increasing globalist consciousness, one which celebrates the transnational, the transcultural individual, the hybridity of all cultures. What happens to the definition of the Jews as a single people with a continuous history of over 3,000 years and a strong sense of transcendent purpose and destiny? Ever since the French Revolution, when Jews first entered political modernity, they had, as you all know, to surrender their collective identity as a people in exchange for full rights as individuals. And this problem has been with us ever since. European Jews had to pay a heavy price for this emancipation contract. The modern state gives with one hand equality and freedom as citizens, individual citizens, and it takes away with the other. To the Jews as Jews, nothing, in the words of Clément Ténère, the first debate of the French National Assembly in 1789. But there were other possibilities. One which I studied and Doron kindly referred to was the case of the Habsburg Empire in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. A multi-ethnic, multinational, multicultural state. One which appeared to offer a promising alternative. One which might guarantee the Jews not only equality before the law, but also cultural, national autonomy as part of its ethnic diversity. And indeed, we see towards the end of this strange creation called the Habsburg monarchy that a supranational Catholic dynasty comes to regard the Jews in its realm, this cosmopolitan, multilingual, transnational group, as being one of the pillars of its unity, staatserhaltend, maintaining the state. And at the turn of the century, the 20th century, a number of thinkers, Jewish and non-Jewish, the Russian Jewish historian Simon Dubnov, Nathan Birnbaum, the Austro-Marxist Karl Arena, some of the Bundists in the Russian Empire, began to look to this model of cultural national autonomy within a multi-ethnic state as a possible solution to the Jewish dilemma, providing that this state would become federal, liberalized, decentralized, and democratized. A kind of Switzerland written large. These hopes were dashed by the bullets that hit the heir to the Habsburg throne, Francis Ferdinand, in July 1914, in Sarajevo, the multicultural capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and which triggered the First World War. A war which unhinged Central and Eastern Europe. However, there were those nearly 20 years before Sarajevo who saw further, beyond the multicultural utopia that seemed conceivable at that time. One of them was Theodor Herzl, who understood that the nationalist struggle developing at the end of the 19th century in this empire spelled a future catastrophe for the Jews, because they were trapped in the crossfire of ethnic conflicts between Germans and Czechs, between Poles and Ukrainians, between Hungarians and Romanians, Croats and Slovaks. And this was reinforced, of course, by Herzl's experience of politics in fin de siècle Republican France, the first Dreyfus trial, and the feeling that the age of liberal emancipation in Europe was dead. The only escape from a combination of ethnic conflict, racist anti-Semitism, and the mass politics of an unstable, democratizing polity would be the return to Zion, a mass exodus from Europe. This is what I try and unravel in my new book, which was mentioned earlier, which looks at the paradox of how Jews, after their emancipation in this multinational state, after their spectacular participation, with dizzying success, one must say, before the First World War, nevertheless were living in what turned out to be a delusion, because this pluralist and in many ways admirable but deeply problematic empire was the seedbed which gave birth to the monstrosity of Hitlerism. The Jews of that age were the supranational element that gave color and vitality to so many of the cities of Central Europe, to Vienna, to Budapest, to Prague, Trieste, Krakow, Czernowitz, and so on. And yet, this provoked a terrifying and ferocious backlash. In a way, the storm clouds had appeared at least 30 years earlier. We could go back to Heinrich von Treitschke. Interesting also from the point of view of the connection between multiculturalism and anti-Semitism. The famous Berlin historian, who in 1897 pronounces, "Die Juden sind unser Unglück," the Jews are our misfortune, and warns that his countrymen will never tolerate a German-Jewish Mischkultur. 20 years later, an expatriate Englishman, a Germanophile, writes a book, a bestseller, called Die Grundlagen des 19. Jahrhunderts, The Foundations of the 19th Century. Houston S. Chamberlain, living in polyglot Vienna, writes a book which could be read through a negative dialectic as the antithesis of everything that multiculturalism would stand for. What does he deplore? The national chaos, the Völkerchaos, the racial mishmash, the cultural degeneration, the materialism, the egoism of big city life. And who promotes this? The Jews. A work which contrasts the radiant Germanic Aryanism and the dissolvent Jewish influence, which becomes one of the Bibles of modern racist anti-Semitism. Everything that the contemporary multiculturalist would advocate, pluralism, benefits of ethnic and cultural diversity, the contribution of colored peoples, the right to difference, the celebration of the marginal and suppressed voices, gender history, the oppression of minorities, was of course anathema to Chamberlain, as it was and would be to this day to all white supremacists and anti-Semitic racists. And Jews were seen as the source of this multicultural infection. They were the destroyers of aristocracy, the subverters of hierarchy, of authority, of classical order, and Christian morality. Then a young man arrives from the Austrian provinces in Vienna in 1907. And he arrives already with a notion of his homeland, this dynastic empire, as a living corpse, an impossible state, a conglomerate of races, Rassenkonglomerat, whose hybrid nature dooms it to destruction. In the imagery with which Adolf Hitler describes multinational Austria in Mein Kampf, we have numerous biblical echoes. Austria is a Völker Babylon, a Babylon of nationalities. The imperial parliament, the Reichsrat, is a linguistic Babel of chaos, confusion, non-communication. The accents he hears on the Vienna streets and in the Prater grate on his ears as a babel of tongues, the living proof of the Blutschande, of the race mixing that is the original sin that will bring down civilization. Turn of the century Vienna is presented as irredeemably corroded by the poison of foreign nations. And Hitler recalls how sickened he felt by the whole mixture of Czechs. There were more Czechs in Vienna than in Prague, by the way. Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Serbs and Croats, and everywhere the eternal mushroom of humanity, Jews and more Jews. This encounter with a Babel of languages and races becomes the seedbed of ideological Nazi-style anti-Semitism. This is the antithesis of the Promethean vision of an ethnically homogeneous, a monolithic Germanic Reich, a kind of new version of the Tower of Babel, which will be totally Judenrein, which will be cleansed forever of Jews. Let's make a leap now, away from the old continent to North America. In many respects, the cradle of democratic pluralism and multiculturalism. One that, in comparison with Europe, past and present, might seem relatively free of anti-Semitism. I don't have time to go into the, in many ways, very interesting example of Canada. So I will stick with the United States and ask the question whether indeed it is the great exception. And if so, why? Interestingly, the Nazis themselves, particularly in the late 1930s, had no doubt that America was an exception. And they had a ready-made explanation. The United States was thoroughly Judaized, Negrified, a racial hodgepodge, indeed a rubbish heap of social debris washed up on its shores from Europe. The ethnic melting pot was not a real nation at all, a rootless civilization inspired, in Goebbels' words, by the most vulgar commercialism, a land of millionaires, mafiosi, beauty queens, stupid records, and irredeemably bad taste, ruled by a Jew-ridden plutocracy. President Roosevelt, some of you may recall, was always referred to in wartime Nazi propaganda as either as the Jew Roosevelt or as the servant of the Jews, Roosevelt, Judenknecht Roosevelt. One of the alarming things about contemporary society, whether in the Middle East or in Europe, is that some of this anti-Semitic, anti-Americanism has been reinvented. The Islamist suicide bombers, for instance, I'm thinking in particular of the Egyptian, Mohammed Atta, in attacking the Twin Towers of Manhattan on 9/11, were convinced they were striking at the evil heart of world capitalism and global finance, headed by, what else, Jewish Wall Street. The World Trade Center in the heart of Jewish New York, symbolizing the anonymous powers of globalization and plutocratic America. Headquarters of the Jewish Crusader civilization, and allegedly seeking to destroy Islam and the cultural identity of all true Muslim believers. The mainly Saudi-born jihadis who carried out this mass murder in effect believed that they were destroying a modern Tower of Babel, with New York as the whore of Babylon, and themselves as Allah's messengers and avengers against American imperial arrogance. Shortly after 9/11, if I may quote for once something that I wrote, this a remark. The cataclysm of the Manhattan Massacre is in fact more than just an example, another example of international terrorism. The symbolism of the burning towers announced a new kind of worldwide jihad. It was a dramatic fanfare for the Islamic fascism of the 21st century, whose perpetrators are bent on total confrontation, on the either-or politics of victory or death. The politics of either-or, particularly towards the Jews and the West, that was a Nazi trademark. Like the theory of the world Jewish conspiracy, partly inspired by the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And there are many parallels with what are called in this article, it had the headline, the new Islamic fascism. One of the startling parallels can be found in something that Albert Speer wrote in 1947, recalling how towards the end of the war, Hitler would sit in trance surrounded by Speer and his acolytes, picturing to himself the destruction of New York in a hurricane of fire. And Speer goes on to describe how, in a kind of delirium, he would describe the skyscrapers being turned into gigantic burning torches, collapsing one upon the other, the glow of the expanding city illuminating the dark sky. That's a quote. It was Osama bin Laden's disciples who transformed or translated this Götterdämmerung, this twilight of the gods, imagery, into a fact over 50 years later. Not surprisingly, the assault on the Twin Towers enthused, electrified, thrilled neo-Nazis around the world and American patriots of the Timothy McVeigh stripe, because this was seen as a blow against what is called in these circles ZOG, Zionist occupied government. That is the US federal government. And in Europe too, after some initial solidarity with what had happened in the United States, there was a noticeable degree of schadenfreude in circles, particularly on the left and among the anti-American and Zionist-bashing intelligentsia. Here is what an American scholar, Andrei Markovits, commented, which is particularly relevant for our conference, and I'd like to give you this quote at some length. Asking himself why the German left, for instance, could be, or parts of it, could be enthused by bin Laden's exploit, he writes the following: the aversion arises also because the United States, and especially New York, represents the greatest social experiment on earth. We have an existing multicultural society, which enemies of the United States reject. Citizens from 82 countries and US citizens of every conceivable religion, ethnicity, and skin color died in the World Trade Center. Anywhere else, this would have been unthinkable. Yet this kind of multiculturalism has become part of everyday life in New York and perhaps in Los Angeles over the last 15 years. Potential success in constructing a truly multicultural society is as much of a red flag for the enemies of America as is its leadership in the process of globalized capitalism. End of quote. Old world loathing of America has, of course, many other reasons, which I do not need to go into, but the most obvious of which would be sheer resentment at the scale of American power. But it also has, and this has been noted by many observers, some striking similarities to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in its imperviousness to logic, facts, and sometimes even to self-interest. Look at what is going on in many of the European universities and mainstream media today, where it is almost a given that the Israel lobby, meaning Jews, control America, where neocon is a euphemism for Jews, and soft versions of the Zionist crusader conspiracy abound. And that is blamed and held responsible for Islamist terrorism. And of course, in Europe, there is the cumulative effect of Muslim and Arab immigration, of the dialogue, the Euro-Arab dialogue, which has developed an almost conditioned reflex of anti-Americanism and anti-Israel feeling. Indeed, this is what the Swiss scholar, whom I'm glad is here with us today, Batya Or, has pointed out in her book, Eurabia, the role which this dialogue sounds so innocuous and seemingly attractive, the role that it has played in favoring the emergence of an Israelophobic culture in which hatred of America, disinformation, and vicious comments about Jews abound. And this in turn partly explains the extraordinary reluctance to recognize the potentially genocidal aspects of the jihadist challenge to Israel and the West. Of course, we could say none of this is surprising, given the fact that throughout most of European history, Jews have been the representative and the dominant other. We do not need to rehearse here, but I'm sure it will be done in different contexts throughout the conference, how images of the rootless Jew, the nomadic, the protean Jew, the highly mobile and international Jew, has become a deeply entrenched stereotype in the Christian and post-Christian West. And yet, many Jews hoped and believed that a new Europe has arisen in the post-war era, and particularly towards the end of the 20th century, the European Union, post-national, multicultural, and pluralist. A union seemingly looking beyond national sovereignty, looking beyond outdated concepts of homogeneous cultural communities. A new Europe which had learned the lessons of history. To quote Alain Finkielkraut, the credo of this new Europe: never again empire, never again warmongering, never again nationalism, never again Auschwitz. But there is a catch, because so many of the bien-pensant Europeans who repudiate anti-Semitism, who honor the Holocaust victims, who abhor Nazism, denounce Israel as the prototype of a racist apartheid state, a warmongering rogue state. And this vilification stems, as Finkielkraut and many others have pointed out, today it stems from an anti-racist ideology, one which uses the discourse, the language of human rights and of multiculturalism against America, against Israel and the Jews. A prime example of this syndrome would be the Mayor of London, my alma mater, Mr. Ken Livingstone, once a member of the British far left, a man who for years denounced Ariel Sharon and George Bush, more recently as war criminals, but more recently, in February 2006, gratuitously insulted a Jewish reporter from the Evening Standard, Oliver Feingold, calling him a Nazi concentration camp guard. Even more recently, he told the Reuben brothers, two Iraqi-born Jewish property developers in London who had been British citizens for 40 years, to go back where they came from. He mistakenly believed they came from Iran. Go back to the Ayatollahs of Iran. This was after the Iranian president had made his well-known comments about genocide and Holocaust denial, threatening to wipe Israel off the map. Did Mr. Livingstone apologize? Of course not. But just imagine if he had insulted a black Briton or reporter, or God forbid, a Muslim. All hell would have broken loose. Either his resignation would have been forced instantly, or a groveling apology would have ensued. But there was no apology to Mr. Feingold, to the Reuben brothers, and certainly not to the Anglo-Jewish community, because in the Rainbow Coalition of Mr. Livingston and those who think like him, there is no place. There is no place for Anglo-Jewry. A man with impeccably anti-racist and multiculturalist credentials had no problem with rolling out the red carpet for Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, one of the great authorities of the Muslim world, an out-and-out fundamentalist, an honoured guest of the City of London. Despite his advocacy of suicide bombing, of wife beating, of homophobic legislation, and various anti-Semitic utterances, which were all presented by anti-democracy indeed. We could go on. And Sheikh Qaradawi was presented to the millions of Londoners not only as a welcome and honoured guest, but as a progressive. This red-green coalition has serious strategic implications for the West. And some of these have been laid out in a new book by Melanie Phillips, who would have been at this conference were it not that her book is about to or has come out now. It's called Londistan, a book which I know from, despite the fact that I've not read it, I know Melanie Phillips well enough, and I know what the thesis is, that the concept of multiculturalism, which so many liberals, leftists, and Western Jews vigorously supported over the years, has become a kind of Trojan horse, which has enabled Islamic fundamentalists to establish a prime international hub in the UK to promote global jihad. There's no doubt that this is true. I've followed this question myself closely enough. It took many years before people like Abu Hamza al-Masri or Sheikh Abdallah al-Faisal were put behind bars for racist incitement in the UK. And their utterances, their preaching, their activities, the activities of the Finsbury Park Mosque were well known to the British police and intelligence services. And they recruited mujahideen to battle the infidel in Afghanistan, Kashmir, Chechnya, Iraq, and Pakistan, and Palestine. And in Britain itself, these preachers of hatred spread the vilest anti-Semitism, anti-Americanism, and hatred of Hindus. They were greatly helped, and this is very important, they were greatly helped by excessively liberal immigration laws, a benign tolerance for many years of the British government, police and intelligence services. That changed only 2 to 3 years ago. And above all, by the complacency of the British elites, whether in Parliament, and I saw this for myself, in the media, in academia, the worst of all, the churches, and we'll hear more about that from Margaret Brearley, among intellectuals and public opinion makers. Every conceivable excuse was found to explain away the dangers of fundamentalism. And in this discourse, it's Israel that has borne the brunt, that has been the scapegoat for the would-be appeasers. This situation is not unique to the UK. It's not fundamentally different in France, in Belgium, in Holland, in Sweden, and so on. And there are, of course, longer-term factors that I won't go into here tonight that explain the pressures, the catastrophically low birth rate of Europeans today, the need for mass immigration, and the political and cultural axis that has been formed between the leaders of the European Union and the Arab world. And multiculturalism has been a gate that has opened and been exploited very effectively, in effect to subvert the fundamental values and principles of Western society, to prevent the integration of so many Muslims in Europe. Even the more subtle and sophisticated preachers of a seemingly European-minded Islam, such as Tariq Ramadan, when they talk about integration, what they mean is something completely different from what most Europeans, and indeed Jews, would understand by this term. What they mean is their right to Islamicize the non-Muslim environment. Any exchange, any dialogue is in effect a one-way street. And yet, intellectuals like Tariq Ramadan have found allies among the anti-globalists and others, and have skillfully exploited the multicultural tolerance that exists to further their fundamentalist aims. In all of this, as you may have gathered, European Jews have come willy-nilly, not for the first and surely not for the last time in their history, to act as canaries in the minefield. In the ongoing larger question of the place of Islam in Europe and in the West. Obviously, in France, this has been the most acute problem of all, for the obvious reason that this has the largest Jewish community and the largest Muslim community in Europe. And that is the reason why we will hear a number of lectures. 2 whole sessions will be devoted, for very good reason, to the French case. And we're very pleased that we have a variety of distinguished analysts and scholars, among them Shmuel Trigano, Georges Ben-Soussan, and a Muslim, Murad El-Khattab, who has a message that I believe it's very important for all of us to hear. I won't elaborate too much on the French case for the very reason that it will be dealt with extensively later on. But I do want to mention that a number of recent events, most obviously the macabre torture and murder of Ilan Halimi, kidnapped by an Islamist gang calling themselves Les Barbares, whose leader was a Muslim from West Africa. That this case, I think, has been one of the wake-up calls, it remains to be seen to what extent, which may lead to the beginnings of a change, of a shift in attitudes. The declarations of the Iranian president, the electoral victory of the Hamas in the Palestinian Authority, many events, the Danish cartoons crisis, and many other recent events have, I believe, begun a process that we cannot really yet anticipate of thinking again about multiculturalism, about the Palestinians, about terrorism, and about radical Islam. Two items from recent news illustrate this point. The Dutch press agency indicated that 43% of Netherlanders believe Islam is not a peaceful religion. 63% do not think it is compatible with modern European society. Obviously, that would not have been possible before the beheading, the gruesome beheading of Theo van Gogh in broad daylight in a street in Amsterdam. Not so long ago. But even more striking is the trends that have been revealed by the Allensbach Institute for Public Opinion Research in Germany. These results are in some ways staggering. They show 83% of Germans associate Islam with fanaticism, 71% with intolerance, 62% with backwardness, 60% undemocratic. An overwhelming 91% say that Islam discriminates against women. 3/5 of all Germans believe there is a clash of civilizations. And an even higher number now think it can only worsen. So perhaps we're reaching some limit in the acceptance of multiculturalism as a viable option as currently constituted in West European popular opinion. What has not happened, and I see no signs of it happening, is that Europe's elites are in touch with these trends. On the contrary, it seems that the will to appease has, if anything, grown in intensity. Take Sweden, in Malmö, for instance, Sweden's third largest city. Both the government and the media ignored the rapes, the robberies, the school burnings, the honor killings, and the anti-Semitic incitement among local Muslims, blaming it on Swedish racism. The Danish cartoons, I will just give you one quote to remind us all how this peaceful, seemingly insignificant nation on the radar screen, suddenly Danes became, for a while, the most hated nation on earth, with their embassies under attack, their flag being burned, their consciousness being raised by lectures on religious tolerance from Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other beacons of enlightenment. And what did the European Union Foreign Minister Solana do in response? Immediately went on a tour of Arab nations, assuring them that he shared their anguish, the anguish of all Muslims offended by these cartoons. Well, that's one example. There are many others of the politics of appeasement. But also, surely, this is connected with a long-range process of multiculturalist political correctness, which has literally run riot. A word about the United States and the question I raised earlier, but have not yet sought to answer. To what extent is it an exception to the uneasy connection between multiculturalism and anti-Semitism? I was a student, as a young student, in California, at probably the most violent, eruptive period of American history in living memory, the 1966-68 period at Stanford University. I remember a few days after I arrived, going to a mass meeting and listening to an Afro-American agitator who later moved to Africa, Stokely Carmichael, ranting on about what he called, this was in 67, just after the Six-Day War, what he called kosher fascism, and white Israel's oppression of the colored Palestinians. I remember, because I was still in the USA, the New York teachers' strike, which pitted a Jewish teachers' union against black community activists. And I saw the beginnings of the unraveling of the black-Jewish civil rights alliance. And subsequently, in the 1970s, we need to remind ourselves of this history for a moment in relation to American multiculturalism and anti-Semitism. In the 1970s, there was a conflict between the Jewish and black positions on affirmative action. There was the Baki case and others. And the perception in the Afro-American community was the Jews have achieved access to white America, and now they're closing the door. This was followed by the Andrew Young affair, 1979, the rise of Jesse Jackson, who was the first black presidential candidate, 1984, and that was a Jackson who talked about Zionism as poison, who embraced Arafat, spoke about Hymietown and the Jews' persecution complex. Later, Jackson sought to mend his bridges. And of course, the Nation of Islam and its charismatic leader, whom I heard speak, one of the most brilliant demagogues I think I've ever heard in my life, Louis Farrakhan. Anti-white, anti-homosexual, and anti-Semitic. The same Louis Farrakhan who branded Judaism a gutter religion, who openly proclaimed his admiration for Adolf Hitler, and flirted with Colonel Gaddafi, the bad old Colonel Gaddafi. And there was worse to come. Those of you who are from the United States will be all too familiar with this, but still it's worth mentioning in passing. Dr. Leonard Jeffries, tenured professor at City University of New York, chair of the Black Studies Department, makes an incendiary anti-Semitic speech on the 20th of July 1991, in which he says that rich Jews organized and controlled the slave trade, that Russian Jews in league with the mafiosi had developed a financial system that led to the destruction of black people, and that Jewish Hollywood had consistently conspired to paint blacks in a demeaning light. This went on through the 1990s, particularly the accusation that Jews were tormentors of the black race and architects of slavery. And of course there was Crown Heights in Brooklyn in 1991, which has been called the first organized anti-Semitic riot in American history. At the time, the chairman of the Afro-American Studies Department at Harvard, Henry Gates Jr., said this was orchestrated anti-Semitism from the top down, promoted by leaders who affected to be speaking for a larger resentment. He received death threats, and he was disavowed by other black leaders. Of course, there's more than anti-Semitism involved here. And what's involved is relevant to the whole issue of multiculturalism. Afro-Americans, with some reason, regard themselves as the definitive other in American society. Jews, from their point of view, have white skin privilege. They can pass, they can be absorbed into the great American melting pot. For Afro-Americans, race is the great dividing line. White racism is the only oppression which really counts. Jews, on the other hand, are seen, again with some justification, as being successful, rich, and even powerful. By the 1960s, at least, they had made it. And that's when the trouble started. They were part of the dominant white establishment. So how then can American Jews claim to be a vulnerable minority? Why is there a Holocaust museum at the heart of Washington, D.C., on the Mall, but no equivalent museums or monuments to Negro slavery or the genocide of American Indians? Jews, American Jews, of course, see this very differently. And part of their trepidation, part of the suspicion now that exists towards contemporary multiculturalism is surely related to the reactions, the earlier reactions I've described. David Bialy has said, and I think there is much to be in favor of this, that American Jews see themselves as outsider-insiders, or insider-outsiders. But they occupy an anomalous status, a liminal zone. Yes, they have influence, but they are still a minority. An increasingly small minority in the larger multicultural landscape of the United States. Yes, they are fully American, but they have a strong ethnic identity. They are powerful and simultaneously vulnerable. They believe in equal opportunity for individuals, not for groups. So they're uneasy with the non-white minorities' exclusive emphasis on race and ethnicity, distrustful of a multicultural identity politics which is based on grievance, resentment, complaint, and demand for reparation. All this at a time when visible discrimination against Jews in America has virtually disappeared. And one might add, this appears repeatedly in the literature on the subject, it is very disconcerting for American Jews to see that much of the multiculturalist discourse today essentializes race, treats it as a fixed quality, something reminiscent, uncomfortably reminiscent of European racism and anti-Semitism. The Jewish experience in America showed that despite anti-Jewish exclusion, the social restrictions, the discrimination in housing, employment, and so on, which existed for at least 70 years, probably up until about 1950. Despite this, such disadvantage could be overcome. So why should the same not be true for blacks, for Latinos, for Asian Americans, and others? And then there is the fact that much of the multiculturalist discourse comes today from the left, and is very insensitive, not to say indifferent, to Jewish interests, refuses to take anti-Semitism seriously. And as for the historic status of Jews as victims, as outsiders, as an oppressed group, well, this is literally disappearing before our eyes in the larger multiculturalist narrative of racism and exclusion. The place of the Jews has been taken by Native Americans, by Afro-Americans, increasingly it will be by Hispanics, and perhaps by Muslims. This is very galling, particularly to Jewish radicals who feel left out, isolated, in a racial divide between whites and peoples of color, who cannot feel comfortable with this multiculturalist emphasis on group rights. To be relegated to the canon of belonging to what is called the dead white Euro-American males. What a fate for a Jewish radical. To no longer be the dominant other, to be part of the privileged and the powerful. Is it so different in Europe? That is a question that we will have to address. Certainly one is struck by the presence of Jewish intellectuals in Europe, in France, but in other places, who can be found on all the battlefronts promoting multiculturalist and anti-racist causes. But much of this is a vicarious identification with the other, the tradition of the non-Jewish Jew, one who is detached and alienated from the Jewish people. What Isaac Deutscher so many years ago described as living on the borderlines of various cultures in society, being part in society but not of it. In conclusion, let me come back to the biblical starting point, to the parable of the Tower of Babel and the question of what has happened to the politics of ethnic diversity, of pluralism and multiculturalism. It seems to me that the current direction which I've sketched out, whether for America or Europe, is literally a cul-de-sac, certainly for Jews, but ultimately for the larger society. So if multiculturalism can recover a viable and relevant message, then I think it has to return to the sources. And that means respect, real respect for diversity. Loving the stranger, however contre nature, needs to be taken a lot more seriously. Creating a public space for the other, overcoming hubris and opposing the totalitarian project. That is not the world we currently live in. It's not the globalizing, multiculturalist universe that is emerging today. That, I think, is the most important single reason why we're having this conference in Jerusalem today, because we are at a historic turning point, perhaps in the history of this planet, one in which the return of anti-Semitism, along with terrorism, jihad, and ethnic identity politics of the kind I've described, presents a major existential challenge to our present and our future. Thank you for your attention.